Hello viewers, 4DIYers here with another tutorial video for everyone. In this particular video here, I'll be doing a demonstration on how to replace the passenger side or right axle on a Volvo C30. Similar procedures can also be found in the S40, V50, and C70 models. Start by safely elevating the front of the vehicle. Unfortunately, the previous owner let the ripped CV joint boot go too far. When the boot is ripped, this gives an area for the grease to escape, then allowing foreign contaminants to enter the assembly, eventually wearing out the components. Beyond a ripped boot, a joint can also have its lubrication dry out, or the joint simply wears out over time. Remove the wheel. Typically, a dry or worn CV joint can cause vibrations under acceleration or at certain speeds, create a clicking sound, and then having the joint growl similar to a bearing depending on the severity. Place a jack stand under the subframe as a safety measure. There will be 3 T25 torx screws which need to be removed on the rear of the fender liner. Removing the liner isn't necessarily needed. I have already had it out for the serpentine belt replacement, and it gives a little extra room for working. Then remove the 5 T25 torx screws at the front of the fender liner. Remove the two 10mm plastic nuts on the inside of the fender liner, just behind the strut assembly. Remove the 1 T30 torx screw for the belly pan that fastens directly to the liner. Now to remove the liner. I find it's easiest to pull the inside portion behind the strut back towards you to disconnect it from the threaded studs where the 10mm plastic nuts sit, then pull it down. And finally pull the top edge up and lift out. Next, remove the 21mm nut on the lower ball joint. Before breaking that taper on the ball joint free, remove the 13mm in the center of the spindle. Here I'm using a 20-volt impact wrench made by OEM Tools, model number 24481 from Mobile Distributor Supply. Be sure to check out my review video for this impact wrench, and a link will be included in the description below. If you are using a ratchet, you may need someone to hold the brakes to prevent the spindle from spinning. However, it's much easier using an impact wrench. To break that ball joint free, I'll be using a ball joint separator instead of a tuning fork. With a tuning fork, you do risk the chance of ripping that boot, which would jeopardize the integrity of the ball joint. Now there is tension on the control arm still, so it won't fall down. I used a pry bar between the control arm and sway bar in order to help fully disconnect that ball joint. You can also use a block of wood between that control arm and sway bar to keep it down. Instead, I just allowed the control arm to rest against the sway bar. To separate the spline between the axle and the spindle, mine wasn't stuck and I was able to pull it apart by hand. If you are running into issues, you may need to assist it out with a hammer. As you can see, my attempt of sealing up the old ripped boot using a mix of sealant, strong tape, and cable ties. This was just to hold me over after applying new grease when I was waiting in between better weather and for my new axle to arrive. In a pinch it does work, but it's not something I typically recommend. Removing the retaining clamp which houses the bearing for the axle, this uses two 10mm bolts. This is an extremely tight area to work. The top bolt can be accessed with a shallow socket and a 3/8 drive ratchet. The lower bolt, on the other hand, can only be accessed using a wrench. It would be best to place an oil pan below the transaxle where the axle sits in, as oil will be dripping out from the location when the axle is removed. Now pull the axle out and completely remove. With the fender liner removed, you may notice a little extra clearance. In order to get a little more room, turning the steering wheel to the right is also a good idea. After excessive searching, while some people have had good experience with aftermarket units, it should also be mentioned that issues with aftermarket units can be quite common as well, unfortunately. This can include vibrations, the shaft shearing off at the spline, and premature failures. I spoke with some different axle and driveshaft rebuilders, and unfortunately, they did not list any rebuild kits for the CV joints. I then emailed GKN directly, who is the factory manufacturer for these Volvo axles, but they do not offer rebuild kits either, and unfortunately the automatic and manual vehicles list different part numbers. If you are in Europe, then you may use the Ford Focus ST axle, which apparently from what I've found is a direct fit. However, by the time an exchange rate was applied, along with shipping and import taxes, it wasn't worth it for me. You can also go with the used route, but the life expectancy can be unknown. So instead I took the plunge and bought an OEM unit from the dealer. To remove the bearing clamp, which may be stuck in place, use a hammer to tap it off. For this, I'm using a dead blow hammer, which prevents the clamp from being damaged. I applied some gear oil to the spline and the surface where the seal seats against. This will help everything slide together and ensures the seal doesn't bind, which may cause a leak. Just to give you a peek where the axle slides into place on the transaxle. It can be a little tricky getting the axle back into the spline. Take your time. Do not force it into place and try not to get the spline dirty either, which may cause installation issues. When that axle is fully in place, you'll know when it aligns with the bearing carrier. I have left the clamp off for a little added movement when installing the spline back into the spindle. You may need to clean the spline and the spindle with a small wire brush. Mine was still clean, so there wasn't any need for that. This time around, I didn't use any lubricant on the spline either. First, get the spline started. Next is pushing the control arm down to reinstall the ball joint. For this, I pushed it down by hand and then inserted something between the sway bar and control arm. Then used a pry bar to push it down a little further to reinstall the ball joint. The axle does have some movement between the CV joints. You'll need to push the spline a little further into the spindle. To finish up, you can use a center spindle bolt to help draw the spline in place, but be extremely careful when doing this. You don't want the spline binding or putting excessive force on the bolt, which may result in it breaking. The torque spec for that bolt is 26 foot-pounds or 35 Newton meters, and then once it's torqued down to value, tighten that bolt an additional 90 degrees. Install the bearing cap. I have already cleaned up the two 10mm bolts with a wire brush and applied a small amount of medium-grade thread locker. The torque spec for these bolts are about 7.5 foot-pounds or 10 Newton meters. Reinstall the ball joint nut, and the torque spec for this is 52 foot-pounds or 70 Newton meters. While I have the fender liner off, considering it was throwing around grease with the ripped boot, I sprayed both the fender liner and fender well with a degreaser, allowed it to soak for a couple minutes, and then washed everything off. After letting everything dry, as a good preventative maintenance step, I sprayed the inner fender using a rust inhibitor wax spray. If you do take this step, make sure you do not spray the belts and brake assembly. Beyond the exterior coating, I also used a supplied nozzle to spray inside of the structural tubing. Reinstall the fender liner. There is a clip on the door side of that fender liner which goes behind the trim, so make sure that is properly installed. Reinstall the wheel and you're done. New videos are released every week on my channel. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button. It's a huge help to me, and leave a comment below if you found this tutorial helpful. If you're not a subscriber, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and thank you for watching.